So this idea of national workshops will come into play in the Revolution of 1848. And maybe we'll talk about that right now. In 1848 in France, there's this revolution against the king. And so, and the king is Louis Philippe, and he flees. And so now there's a provisional government put in place. And the provisional government is now made up of mainly liberals, but also some socialists, like Louis Blanc. Now, because the government is in Paris, we see a large working class population in Paris, many unemployed people in Paris. And so the result is that Paris is more radical than France as a whole. And so in Paris, there's all sorts of socialist agitation, demands that the government do things. And Louis Blanc proposes, and the provisional government puts into place, these national workshops, which will employ all these unemployed people in Paris. Now, ideally, these national workshops would be, these factories. But the reality is it becomes sort of like a public works program, where they're mending fences or building roads. And what happens is so many people are joining these national workshops that basically they become unemployment centers where people get money. And minimal work is being done. Now, when an election happens to elect the new assembly, as I noted, Paris is more socialist than the rest of the country. So the election happens now because of universal manhood suffrage, because it's a Republican revolution, they want universal manhood suffrage. And the result is that many peasants are voting, many people outside of Paris are voting, and the result is that very few socialists get elected. In fact, many monarchists get elected that want to restore the monarchy. And of course, many liberals get elected as well. And so this government will shut down the national workshops because it doesn't support them. These are socialist ideas that the government's interfering in the economy and providing work for the unemployed. Well, the result of this is chaos. All of these unemployed people now being released from these workshops, angry at the government. Once again, we've got this example of a revolution that doesn't live up to the expectation of the masses. And so they want a further revolution. They want the national workshops reinstated. They want socialists and socialist ideas to be implemented by the government. And so what this leads to is the violence of what is called the June Days in June 1848. The government basically suppresses this uprising in Paris. And it's a working class uprising. Many of these people are unemployed workers who were part of the national workshops. They have this uprising against the government, and it is brutally suppressed. Thousands die. And in the aftermath of the June Days and this horrific class warfare, much worse than Gaddafi, the result is that the government in place, the assembly, realizes they need a president quick to make sure that the country can respond to these challenges. So they hastily have an election, and the winner of that election is the man with the most popular name, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who is, of course, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, and adds the name Louis just for kicks. And he wins with 90% of the vote. Yes?
Was Napoleon II?
Well, technically, Napoleon II is the son of Napoleon who never rules. And remember how this works, is that just because you don't get to rule doesn't mean you weren't the legitimate leader. So Louis XVII never ruled because his dad was killed, he should have been in charge, but then he was killed. But he was, even though he didn't actually rule, he was Louis XVII in the royalist opinion, because he was the legitimate monarch. So even though technically he didn't rule for our sake, if you look at it from the royalist view, he was the next person in charge. And likewise, Napoleon's son, who's gone, I don't know what happened to him, probably killed somewhere. Napoleon's son is the legitimate leader after Napoleon was deposed in 1815. So when Napoleon was sent into exile in 1815, then if you're a Bonapartist or a supporter of the Bonapartist monarchy, then you would think that Napoleon II was the legitimate ruler of the kingdom.
Oh, I'll be right back.
Okay. So, moving on. So that's 1848 and the revolutions there. Nationalism is a huge, dramatic, tumultuous incident, movement. We see nationalism takes multiple forms. There's political nationalism, which is this idea that the political order should be changed. The boundaries of the state should be changed to reflect the boundaries of the nation. And what is the nation? The nation is some notion of a linguistic, ethnic, religious entity. So that is the nation. And therefore political nationalism argues that that should be those are the only legitimate governments, are those governments that are the leaders of the nation. And so if you have a government that controls a part of a nation, for example, Saxony, or for example, Naples, it's part of a bigger nation, like Germany in the case of Saxony, or Italy in the case of Naples, then that's not a legitimate government. It should be replaced with a German or national government. So what nationalism is proposing is replacing all of the governments of Central and Eastern Europe with governments that reflect the national groups that are there. We see this first in Italy and Germany, and then as we go east, we see it with Poles, and we see it with Slavs, Czechs, and or Southern Slavs, Czechs, and nationalism, continuing on, the Russian nationalism and things like that. Now, cultural nationalism is this idea that you need to revive your culture. And so cultural nationalism will focus on reviving cultural customs, researching the history of your nation, and of course, language. Using your language. Writing in your language. So it'll be during the 19th century that there will be movements to try to, reclaim Gaelic in Ireland, a language that's dying because of English occupation of Ireland. Or attempts to begin to use Czech instead of the German that was often used for formal writing. So that's nationalism. But the political nationalism is the issue here. What is a legitimate government? And as I pose this question, right, what ultimately makes California not a nation? Why is the United States a nation? Or why isn't Canada part of our country? Right? It's sort of this amorphous concept of nationalism. Like, what exactly is a nation? And you can imagine that because if you were in Naples, you've been under a Neapolitan government. That's the term for the Neapolitan government for centuries there. There's never been in Italy. The last Italian government, besides the brief kingdom of Italy created by Napoleon, was the Roman Empire. So what is this Italy of which these nationalists speak? And for many in Naples, many think, yes, we're part of this Naples. But many conservatives in Naples will say, no, we have this legitimate Naples government. And so we see resistance to nationalism in many areas, as well as those embracing nationalism and overturning these very historic medieval kingdoms.